So on last night's episode of WWE Monday Night Raw, Raw held its first round of matchups for the King of the Ring tournament. Obviously, the first talking point will be the main event, Jey Uso taking on Ilya Dragunov in a matchup that I was really looking forward to because it had that element of surprise of who was going to win. Obviously, Ilya Dragunov and Gunther have been on a collision course ever since their last matchup in NXT a few years ago. Given that history, given the match quality that it could have produced, a lot of people, myself included, were kind of rooting for Ilya Dragunov to emerge victorious against Jey Uso. But ultimately, because of a reversal and a counter into what will become a super kick, spear, and then a jump off of the top rope, Jey Uso would defeat Ilya Dragunov, advancing to the semifinals of the King of the Ring tournament. I would be remiss on not mentioning what happened with Gunther. He did have a matchup against Kofi Kingston earlier in the night where Gunther would emerge victorious. And I do believe that that very much was the match of the night. The story that they had told leading up to the matchup. Obviously, we know the history between Xavier Woods and Gunther. Xavier Woods had won the King of the Ring tournament back in 2021. And obviously, he wanted to be able to defend the crown in this tournament. But because of an attack by Imperium, Xavier Woods was not cleared. He's injured at the moment. So who did he rely on? One of his best friends, Kofi Kingston. As Kofi Kingston would enter the tournament, defeating Rey Mysterio over the live events this past weekend, and thus having to challenge Gunther. Gunther, wanting to become the King of the Ring, knew who was in his path, knew who was in his way, and Kofi Kingston, knowing how much this tournament means to his best friend, Xavier Woods, he wanted to be able to defend the crowd in his honor. But an angry and irate Kofi Kingston would take advantage of this opportunity against Gunther as he would attack him before the bell even rang. It got to the point where Kofi was targeting the lower limbs of Gunther and had the upper hand for the majority of the matchup. But as the match progressed, Gunther would attack the lower back of Kofi Kingston. And over the course of this matchup, again, if you hadn't had the chance to see it and you just saw highlights, go back and watch the match in its entirety. He would target the back of Kofi Kingston, really nailing it into him, and ultimately defeating Kofi 1-2-3. The semifinals for the men's King of the Ring tournament on the Raw bracket, that is set, as we will see Jey Uso taking on Gunther, a rematch of a match that took place a couple months ago. Ultimately, that was due to interference by Jay's brother Jimmy, but nonetheless, I do think we're going to see Gunther emerge victorious. I think he's destined to win the King of the Ring tournament. He's obviously going to go in the finals. But now taking a look at the Ilya Dragunov aspect of it, I think ultimately it was probably the smarter move to hold off Ilya versus Gunther. That's a matchup in itself, could run 30 minutes on any PLE. If you wanted to give it away free on Monday Night Raw, that's up to them. But I think in the long run, we're able to build upon a story. Obviously, there's already history between a Gunther and an Ilya Dragunov, but you're able to craft this storyline where it's meant to be. It's destiny. If you look back at an interview that Ilya Dragunov had after being drafted to Monday Night Raw, they asked him what his thoughts on, being on the same brand as a Gunther, someone he has history with. And he said, in a word, destiny. This is a matchup that could definitely be for a World Heavyweight Championship. I look forward to the prospect of that match in itself. But that's going to be placed on the back burner. That's a match that's going to be happening at a later date, perhaps at a WrestleMania. And speaking of the King of the Ring tournament, we look at the women's bracket, the Queen of the Ring tournament. Shayna Baszler, who had defeated Maxine Dupree over the live events this past weekend, was facing Io Sky in the first matchup for the women's bracket in the quarterfinals rounds. In what was a competitive matchup, again, another match that demonstrating how important it was to target an extremity in a match of this quality. We saw that Shayna Baszler was attacking Io Sky's arm, and then Shayna Baszler ultimately had the match won, but Io Sky was able to emerge victorious, advancing to the semifinals of her bracket, respectively. And on the other side, we saw a matchup of Lyra Valkyria versus her opponent, Zoe Starks, who obviously is one of the best friends and partners of a Shayna Baszler. I look forward to that prospect of an Io Sky versus a Lyra Valkyria. I think it's destined for Io to win. I think she's going to go into the finals. But nonetheless, the story that they're telling between Lyra Valkyria and Becky Lynch, and having it all kind of interwebbed with one another, As Lyra is in the King of the Ring tournament, I think ultimately what will happen is Damage Control or Liv Morgan of that nature will interfere, allowing Io Sky to emerge victorious. And then all this talk about tournaments and the Queen of the Ring and the King of the Ring tournament, let's transition to someone that was originally intended to be a part of the King of the Ring tournament, that being Drew McIntyre. Drew McIntyre would open up the show, open up Monday Night Raw, and of course, one of the first things he would talk about is CM Punk. It is a storyline, it is a feud that has really resonated with a lot of fans because of the sense of realism that it presents, as well as having two of the top talent in the company as well. Ironically enough, probably the best storyline that WWE is telling right now is involving two individuals who are actually injured. Now, Drew McIntyre might be more along the lines of on a path of healthier, whereas CM Punk, we're not really sure where he's at the moment. But the story that these two have been telling, it has become a rivalry that has really become grudge-filled. Some people on the internet clamoring for a potential Hell in a Cell matchup between the two. But if we were to take a step back and look at the genesis of this feud, you would find that it has had that opportunity to have a slow cook. Over time, it became the notion that CM Punk wasn't welcomed by the locker room because of his history, because of his the so-called toxicity that he brings into any locker room that he arrives in. And over the course of the build-up, really, at the Royal Rumble, we see that he wanted to throw out Drew McIntyre. But Drew McIntyre, in the moment, would injure CM Punk, leading us down the path to where we are now. Drew McIntyre has become obsessed with CM Punk as he holds him responsible for his short reign as World Heavyweight Champion at WrestleMania. He would even go so far as to claim that that Damian Priest is that of a paper champion. And in that moment, Damian Priest would emerge from the back, coming out to address Drew McIntyre, and although he would be called a paper champion, he did say that, hey, I am still a champion. And one thing that I really appreciated was over the course of the last year where Damian Priest was Mr. Money in the Bank, he received criticism as to why he wasn't taking advantage of that Money in the Bank contract. And the way they addressed this in this promo I thought was brilliant. He said to Drew McIntyre, hey, I wanted to cash in on Seth Rollins. I would have loved to have it be Drew McIntyre versus Damian Priest for the world title at WrestleMania. But he pointed out that there were multiple times that Drew McIntyre had prevented Damian Priest from successfully cashing in, thus demonstrating that level of karma that Drew McIntyre now has to live through. And I love that the WWE really has been focusing on those little minute details and those callbacks and demonstrating that you have to follow the product, that you have to follow each episode of Monday Night Raw, Friday Night SmackDown, whatever the case may be, because in the long run, it does have consequences. It has ramifications that will affect each individual that is involved. So to see how Drew McIntyre now has to deal with this idea that had I not interfered with these cash-ins, there is a shot that he could be the World Heavyweight Championship. But ultimately, he didn't want to hear it. And in the end, Damian Priest said that if Drew McIntyre really wants a title shot, that he's got it. So ultimately, when Drew McIntyre is healthy, when he is 100%, and when he is ready to go, he will be receiving that world title match against Damian Priest. The question is, where and when? Part of me thought it was going to be at the King of the Ring tournament the way they had really hinted at it, but who's to say it's not going to be at Glasgow, Scotland, when the WWE heads for their latest event this upcoming month in June, where they have Clash at the Castle. Regardless, I don't think they pull the trigger on a Drew McIntyre win for two reasons. One, Damian Priest just got the championship, and WWE has proven that they do appreciate a long-running title reign. As well as, I don't think Drew McIntyre wins because I envision some sort of interference by a CM Punk. There's been a lot of interesting things going on with the Judgment Day as well as we segue into our next topic, because the Judgment Day have been having interactions with one Carlito, who was drafted to Monday Night Raw along with the entirety of the LWO. You see, Dominic Mysterio is of the mindset that is anybody who has any type of issue or beef with his dad, Rey Mysterio, should be involved with the Judgment Day in some form or fashion. We saw that what happened with Andrade, we saw it with Santos Escobar, and now we're seeing it with Carlito. But obviously, Damian Priest isn't too high on this notion. Again, reverting back to the past, because if you remember, at Backlash last year when they went to San Juan, Puerto Rico, Carlito had interfered in the street fight between Damian Priest and Bad Bunny. Now, ultimately, there's a little bit of hesitation there, but Carlito very much seems to be open to the idea. So does Dominic, JD, and Finn Balor. Damian Priest did mention that, hey, if the boys trust you, that's on them. You look at the end of the night, Carlito ends up helping the Judgment Day earn a number one contendership for the tag team championships. It was a fatal four-way matchup involving the Creed brothers. It also had the Authors of Pain. It had the New Catch Republic and JD McDonough and Finn Balor, who were the ones to emerge victorious because of interference from Carlito. This sets in motion as to the next phase of the Judgment Day. Damian Priest seems a little bit more susceptible when it comes to involving itself with Carlito. He did mention, though, hey, you have beef with Rey Mysterio. You got to go ahead and settle that. You got to figure that out. He says, us in the Judgment Day, we don't deal with cowards. So it's interesting to see all these different storylines being told involving the Judgment Day. Obviously, you have Damian Priest as the world champion. You now have Finn Balor and JD McDonough as the number one contenders for the tag team championships. Then there's Carlito, who's trying to become a member within the Judgment Day. Then there's Dominic Mysterio and whatever's going on with Liv Morgan. All this while Rhea Ripley is away healing from her injury. Another group to keep an eye on is that of American Alpha. Over the past couple of months, we've seen the evolution of Chad Gable and see how he has become in terms of a heel. You know, initially he was obsessed with becoming the Intercontinental Champion. He did lose several matchups to Gunther. And on his road to regaining another opportunity at WrestleMania, no less, he would lose a gauntlet match that involved Sami Zayn. And since then, we've really seen the true colors of a Chad Gable. He's become obsessed with becoming the Intercontinental Champion, but also demeaning and disrespecting the other members of his group. You see the way he treats Tozawa, Otis, as well as Maxine Dupree. Maxine Dupree, who was unable to defeat Shayna Baszler in this weekend's live event where she was a part of the Queen of the Ring tournament. And seeing the way he treated her, and then having this idea that the members of his group could somehow soften up his opponents in the triple threat match this upcoming week at the King of the Ring event. He had Akira Tozawa, originally slated to take on Sami Zayn, it would look like, but he would call an audible and have Otis be the one to fight Sami Zayn. And essentially Akira Tozawa would take the matchup that was originally intended for Otis as he would take on Bronson Reed. Now the matchup in itself was what it was. We knew Bronson Reed was going to destroy Akira Tozawa. Me personally, I'm a fan of Tozawa. I think he's wonderful. I think he's hilarious. He's entertaining. So to see him treated the way he is very heartbreaking in kayfabe terms, that is. Obviously, I know it's for the bigger point of a story, but you want to have something better for these baby faces. And speaking of baby faces, you look at Otis, who had a matchup against Sami Zayn. Ultimately, he came up short. He lost. And Chad Gable would go on to berate him, going so far as to call him an idiot, saying it's all his fault. And the slap that he had given Otis was one that rang throughout the entire arena. I feel bad for Otis. I know back in the day when he won the Money in the Bank tournament during the COVID years, I wasn't a fan. But over the course of his tenure with the WWE, I find him endearing. I find his character work very well done. I find myself rooting for Otis. And to see the way he's been mistreated along with the Maxine Dupree and Akira Tozawa, you want to root for them. You want to see Chad Gable get his comeuppance. So to see the evolution of the group, because if you remember, way back when Otis first joined with Chad Gable, the purpose was to train him into being one of the best wrestlers on the roster. So to see how he's been treated as of late by Chad Gable and still see him resort back to being a student for Chad Gable and not standing up for himself, at least not yet, that is. So that's definitely something to keep an eye on. Another feud that has been highlighted on WWE Raw is that of Liv Morgan versus Becky Lynch. I think this feud is definitely intended to get Liv Morgan over and eventually win the Women's World Championship. We saw on this episode of Monday Night Raw, Becky Lynch would win a matchup against Dakota Kai via disqualification, of course, because of interference from the members of Damage Control. And essentially after that attack, Lyra Valkyria would come to her aid, help her out for a moment, but then Becky Lynch was ambushed by Liv Morgan. I think we're going to see Liv Morgan win the Women's World title. I see some speculation that perhaps interference by Dominic Mysterio could be a reason as to how she would win the Women's World title. Nonetheless, I think it's time to pull the trigger on a Liv Morgan. I think the Battle Royal win for a Becky Lynch was temporary. I think it was the right move to not have Liv Morgan win that, because it would have just seemed too hokey for that point being. I think if this was meant to be Liv Morgan's moment, you wouldn't have her win it in a Battle Royal. You want to have it on a one-on-one contest where it means the most, on a premium live event and from a live audience. So to see her defeat Becky Lynch one-on-one would go a long way in terms of how they want to build up this feud with Rhea Ripley. Of course, Rhea Ripley's out with the injury, so I'm curious to see how they build upon without her. But the moment she does return, it's going to be a raucous return for Rhea Ripley, much alike the 2002 return for Triple H when he was in Madison Square Garden, returning from his torn quad injury. Nonetheless, this episode of Monday Night Raw had a lot of substance and a lot of continuing storylines being built upon as we look forward to the King and Queen of the Ring event itself. What did you guys think of Monday Night Raw? Who do you think will emerge from the Raw bracket into the finals of the men and women's tournament? And what are your thoughts on Damian Priest and the Judgment Day and the current state of the Judgment Day as well? Until then, my name is Jose Ramos Jr., and I will be seeing you guys in the next video.